Mr. Chair, we are now live.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. This meeting of the Community Affairs and Planning Committee is being held electronically and live streamed on the town's website. All members of council in attendance are participating by audio and video teleconference, and town staff are available throughout the meeting if council members have any questions on the agenda. For members of the public watching from home, please bear with us if we encounter any technical difficulties throughout this meeting, and I'll now call this meeting of the Community Affairs and Planning Committee to order. We'd like to begin this meeting by acknowledging the land on which we gather is situated within the traditional and treaty territories of the Mississaugas. More specifically, the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation, signatories of the Gunshot Treaty of 1788 and the Williams Treaties of 1923. This land is and will continue to be home of the Indigenous peoples. Let us acknowledge the mistakes and traumas of the past through authenticity and support truth and reconciliation. Let us engage and celebrate Indigenous communities by being leaders of action in acknowledging the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's recommendations towards truth and reconciliation. Let us keep these principles close as we continue towards truth and reconciliation and as we move forward with kindness and respect as a community. So first I'll ask if there's any disclosures of pecuniary interest from council. Seeing none, we'll move on then. I'll need a motion to adopt minutes. Moved by Councillor Bauer, seconded by Councillor Tyler Morin. Any questions, comments on the minutes? All in favor? That passes. There's no public meeting. I think we will start then with, excuse me. We have item 5.1, Green Development and Environmental Design Guidelines Project Update from Director Jeff Romanowski and Cam Richardson, Supervisor of Environmental Sustainability and Climate Change.
Thank you, Chair Lee. And give me a moment and I'll just share my screen here. Let me know if you have any issues viewing that.
We can see it fine.
Perfect. So good evening, Council. Again, my name is Cameron Richardson, and I'm the Supervisor of Environmental Sustainability and Climate Change with the Town of Ajax. In this presentation, I'll be providing an update on the town's Green Development and Environmental Design Guidelines. And I'll be giving a brief background introduction to the guidelines, as well as providing a summary of the results of our public consultation that was hosted earlier this year. As a background, in September of 2019, Town of Ajax declared a climate emergency, and that was to acknowledge the impacts of climate change, as well as to commit to proactively mitigating and adapting to those changes, to those impacts wherever possible. Also, through council motion in 2021, the town endorsed new corporate and community GHG emission reduction targets, as well as joined the city's Race to Zero. The Green Development and Environmental Design Guidelines are identified as an implementation priority in the Ajax Climate Risk and Resiliency Plan, the Crothers Creek Watershed Plan, and the 2018 to 2022 Strategic Plan. And lastly, the guidelines are included in the Town of Ajax's current official plan. So what are the Green Development and Environmental Design Guidelines? Well, essentially, they're a municipal green standard that will establish sustainability-related design guidelines and performance measures within the Town of Ajax for new development. The guidelines have three main objectives. One, to prepare, mitigate, and adapt to climate change. Two is to protect and enhance natural features. And lastly, three is to implement higher building standards and development practices within the town. The project was completed in 3 phases, with phase 1 being background research and analysis that was completed in July of 2021. Phase 2 was the draft guidelines that were proposed, and that was completed in January of this year. A detailed report and presentation on both phase 1 and phase 2 of the guidelines was provided at the November 8th, 2021 Community Affairs and Planning Committee. The third phase and final phase was finalization of those proposed guidelines based on public consultation. So just as a quick reminder, phase 2 had 2 main key deliverables. One was to prepare a draft of the guidelines and the associated performance metrics, and 2 was to solicit valuable feedback on those proposed guidelines. So all feedback and input that was received throughout that consultation was reviewed and incorporated into the final guidelines as appropriate. The following slides are going to explain what activities were undertaken as part of phase 2 public consultation, in addition to providing some of the results of that consultation. So phase 2 consultation, just like the other phases, followed the outreach consultation plan that was developed early on in the project with both the internal project steering committee as well as the consultant team. During phase 2, due to COVID restrictions, that consultation was completed utilizing a modified or virtual public information center that was hosted on the In My Opinion or IMO hub. The public information center included a recorded presentation, related documents and reports, and a fillable feedback form that could be submitted through the website. The draft guidelines, including a guidebook and checklist tool that were developed for development applicants, was posted for a 60-day public commenting period. A detailed summary of all of the consultation initiatives undertaken throughout all 3 phases of this project has been included as attachment 1 in the staff report. So what were the results of our phase 2 consultation? Well, the PIC presentation was viewed 130 times on YouTube and the IMO hub. And we received 16 feedback form submissions, including from organizations such as FLAP Canada, Climate Justice Durham, and the Clean Air Partnership, as well as several local residents. We also received 4 letters of support from the Region of Durham, Town of Whitby, Ajax Youth Engagement Advisory Committee, and the Atmospheric Fund. And several of these letters also included specific recommendations to strengthen the proposed guidelines. Lastly, we received 2 pieces of official correspondence from our partner conservation authorities, being the Central Lake Ontario Conservation Authority and the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. And just like the letters of support, those official correspondence pieces also included several recommendations that could be followed to strengthen the guidelines. So what were the results of that consultation? Now, this table summarizes the feedback received during public consultation of the draft guidelines. This table is included in the staff report, so I'm not going to be going through it in detail in this presentation, but I have bolded the recommendations that we heard most frequently from the respondents. So I'll go through those bolded statements now. The first is that we received a comment that the guidelines should not be a static document, but rather one that changes over time. And this is very typical of a tiered municipal green standard, similar to what the Green Development and Environmental Design Guidelines is. And that means that often the higher optional tiers become mandatory in future editions of those standards. So when the standards are updated, development applicants can anticipate what changes will be coming down the line because those higher optional tiers will likely become mandatory. Under the air impact category, we heard from the majority of respondents that although our proposed EV readiness requirements for low-rise residential was progressive and impactful, the requirements we proposed for mid to high density residential and non-residential needed to be increased. And these comments usually were based on the fact that the EV market in Ontario is expanding very quickly and just had a big announcement for Durham Region today, actually. And also that there's recent technical studies that show that there's significant cost savings that are achieved by making parking spaces EV ready upfront during construction processes compared to the large costs that would be associated with EV retrofits after construction is complete. Under the energy impact category, we heard from almost all of the respondents that the energy performance metrics that we proposed in the draft guidelines would not effectively address the climate emergency or help to reach council-endorsed GHG emission reduction targets. It was also recommended that the guidelines build consistency across Durham Region and align with the Whitby Green Standards energy-related metrics. Lastly, under the natural assets impact category, one of the most frequent feedback pieces we heard from the public was to align our Tier 1 requirements with the CSA bird-friendly building design standards. This was typically because building collisions are the second leading cause of bird and bat mortalities, and adhering to these CSA standards will help to address the biodiversity crisis that is also occurring in parallel to the climate crisis. So the following slides are going to provide a summary of the changes that are being recommended based on the feedback received during public consultation that I just reviewed. So one of the recommendations for update is for the EV infrastructure metric. So in terms of the low density residential metrics, no changes being proposed from the draft guidelines because we heard feedback that they were strong and impactful. Where we are recommending to update is that the mid to high density residential and non-residential tier 1 requirement will now be to design and construct at least 50% of total parking spaces to be EV ready when there are 20 or more parking spaces being provided. Now, it's important to note at this point that EV readiness does not mean that EV chargers will be installed by the proponent or the development applicant. It simply means that the parking space is ready for EV infrastructure without the need for any major retrofit. So for example, this could include having the electrical capacity or panel space nearby, or it could simply mean that conduit has been laid to those parking spaces during construction, which will allow for panel connectivity in the future at very low costs. For the energy performance metrics, this is where we received a lot of public feedback, and essentially for both our low density residential metrics as well as our mid to high density and non-residential metrics, we are recommending that we update to be in line with the requirements of the Whitby Green Standard. So you'll see here in the low density residential tier 1 requirement will now be to achieve or exceed Energy Star for new homes or equivalent. And for the mid to high density residential and non-residential metrics, tier 1 requirement will now be to achieve at least 15% energy efficiency over the Ontario Building Code, or OBC. And lastly, the changes from the draft guidelines that are being recommended tonight are for the bird-friendly design metrics. And for both low density residential as well as mid to high density residential and non-residential, staff are recommending that the tier 1 requirement now be to design the buildings in accordance with the CSA standard. Our proposed draft did have certain aspects of that standard as part of tier 1 requirements, but now we are recommending, based on public feedback, that these tier 1 requirements meet all of the full CSA guidelines. So now I want to give a bit of a summary about how the guidelines themselves will be implemented moving forward if approved by council tonight. So the guidelines will be incorporated and implemented within the existing development application review process starting May 1st of this year. The guidelines will be mandatory and implemented through site plan and draft plan of subdivision applications. And these guidelines will be administered by the environmental planner with support from existing P&D staff. The guidebook and checklist tool will be provided and discussed at all pre-consultation meetings. And the checklist tool, which is a fillable PDF form with yes and no and comment sections, is required to be submitted as part of any initial submission package or resubmissions thereafter. The staff report in section 2.3.b also provides very detailed information on how these guidelines will be implemented. Now, when we're speaking about municipal green standards, incentives are used to strategically encourage the uptake of tier 2 or optional requirements. At this time, it's recommended that the guidelines utilize non-financial incentives, and this could potentially include expedited review, improved marketing of projects through the town's networks, the potential for annual green design awards, and a dedicated staff member like the environmental planner that will help to support tier 2 projects through the planning process. And just like the performance metrics, any available incentives or new incentives will continue to be evaluated and updated as appropriate. And that could potentially include financial incentives in the future. The guidelines will undergo detailed monitoring and implementation tracking to help us evaluate the effectiveness of and gather any applicant feedback throughout the process. It's recommended that the guidelines undergo a comprehensive update every 3 to 5 years. So based on feedback from the building industry, it is recommended that the guidelines undergo comprehensive updates no earlier than every 3 years. And this allows the building industry to both respond to updates effectively, as well as allow them time to incorporate our municipal green standard into their internal work processes. Staff are also recommending that the guidelines be updated no later than every 5 years. This is a very fast-moving industry, and undertaking comprehensive updates will allow us to respond to any emerging trends or new technologies and proven best practices. So based on this recommendation, it will likely be that the guidelines will be updated around 2025 to 2027. So what are our next steps? Well, the guidelines have been finalized based on all of the input received through our phase 2 consultation efforts with all stakeholders. The guidelines will be integrated into the town's existing development application process starting May 1st of this year. And the environmental planner position has been approved as part of the operating budget, and that process to hire that position has already begun. And any required information, including all of the documents like the guidebook and checklist tool, will be made available on the Planning and Building Services website, similar to how we have other planning related documents and design guidelines available. So in conclusion, the guidelines will be vital in addressing the climate change emergency and meeting the council endorsed GHG emission reduction targets by substantially reducing community GHG emissions associated with new buildings in the town of Ajax. Implementing this municipal green standard will also complete major action items identified in Ajax's climate risk and resiliency plan, the Crothers Creek watershed plan, as well as this term of council's strategic plan. And with that, I thank you for having me tonight, and I'm available to answer any questions. We also have Kirsten McKenzie, project lead from our consultant WSP, in case there's any questions for her as well.
Thank you, Mr. Richardson. So that was a very comprehensive report. Really appreciate that. Any members of council have any questions or comments for on the presentation? Look how good you were, Cam. We have Councillor Bauer. Councillor Bauer, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for that excellent presentation. And I love this guideline. And I also love the checklists. I think they're a great idea, excellent resource. So just a few questions just to help me understand. So this will not come into effect until May 1st. So any applications that we have received prior to May 1st will not be mandated to follow these guidelines?
Through the chair to Councillor Bauer, that is correct. Once implemented, these green standards will only apply to developments that start at pre-consultation and move forward in the review process. So anyone that had started that process prior to May 1st will not have to adhere to the green standard. Although I will say the green standard will be provided to them as an education tool in case there are items that they can implement at that time. And it also helps us judge those developments to see how they stack up to the green standard, whether they're achieving all the tier 1 requirements or any optional requirements. And in fact, we've already had inquiries about having that draft document on file so that a developer could look at those and reference them prior to them being implemented.
Awesome. Okay, great. Now, and I know you made mention that these guidelines will become mandatory. So is there a chance that there could be non-compliance to those mandates? And if so, like how would there be penalties for that?
So through the chair to Councillor Bauer, all of the mandatory tier 1 requirements must be addressed and implemented. And the way we do that and ensure that is through our site plan or draft plan of subdivision agreements. So those metrics will be added into any agreement so that the developer or the proponent must implement those in just like any other thing we're agreeing to in those agreements. So we don't anticipate any issues. The City of Toronto has had their green standard for quite a while and has not had any issue in getting those mandatory requirements implemented. So we don't anticipate any issues as long as upfront we communicate at pre-consultation and provide the information necessary. We don't anticipate any issues with that.
Okay, great. Thank you. And my last question is about the regular review and updates to the plan every 3 to 5 years. So let's say an application has been reviewed and tier 1, they have complied with tier 1 and perhaps some of the tier 2 options. And then before the development begins, the plan is reviewed and guidelines are changed or updated, and there are new tier 1s or tier 2s. Would those applications be subject to updates, or would they be originally left alone?
Through the chair to Councillor Bauer, that's a great question. The new requirements would only have to be adhered to from pre-consultation on. So anyone that had started that process prior to the updates would be held to the original edition of the green standard.
Okay, thank you very much. And I was happy to see the comments about bird-friendly design. I did receive several emails from residents concerned about that. So I'm happy to see that that's there. Thank you very much. Those are my
You're
questions.
welcome.
Thank you, Councillor Bauer. Regional Councillor Dyes.
Thank you, and thank you for a great report. I'm really, really pleased to see this come forward. And it was about bird-friendly design as well. And I know that we've incorporated windows into that in the glass so they don't hit the glass. Are we also looking at the design of the building so they don't get pulled into kind of like dark walkways underneath and tunnels?
Through the chair to Regional Councillor Dyes, you're correct. Yes, the CSA bird-friendly design standards do address window markings, reflective windows, as well as what they call fly-throughs through site design. So you want to avoid having areas that a bird can fly through and pick up speed. They also speak to night sky compliant outdoor lighting, because lighting at night can throw off bird migration and attract birds or bats into windows as well. So the CSA standards are pretty comprehensive and involve more than just window markings. They involve a whole bunch of different things related to site design.
Well, thank you for that. And I think it's really, really important as we do intensification with some high rises, because we're in a flight path. So thank you. And again, thanks for your report. It was great.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Any other members of council wish to comment or question the presentation? I have one, Mr. Richardson. So will the developer have a chance to buy the way out of these obligations? So, you know, cash in lieu of parkland, anything like that. Is there an ability for them to be like, you know what, we can't meet this, here is a bucket of cash? Or are we going to be pretty strict with this?
To you, Councillor Lee, Regional Councillor Lee, no, there's no buyout option. The tier 1 metrics are mandatory for all new developments within the town. Having said that, obviously every development is very unique, and we may run into issues that are unique to one development that we've never seen before, which is why we want to undergo detailed monitoring and tracking so that we can adjust to those issues when they come up. For example, one that was raised throughout consultation was that some of these large industrial projects may have upwards of 700 parking spaces that are going into their development. So there may be discussions, and it would be up to the lead development planner on those files to see if, well, do we really need 400 parking spaces out of the total 800 to be EV ready at this point? Or is that too many parking spaces and you don't need a requirement? So you may want to lower that percentage down to, say, 35% or 40%, but really those would be on a case-by-case basis. But no, there would be no buyout option for removing any of the tier 1 requirements. Those need to be satisfied before development can move forward.
Great, thank you very much. Any other members of council? So, Mr. Clerk, I do believe we have 2 delegations, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, we received 2 requests to make delegations tonight. As this is not a public meeting item, there will be a required suspension of the rules to accept the delegations.
So I'll ask for a mover to suspend the rules, which requires a 2/3. We have Councillor Khan, followed by seconded by Regional Councillor Crawford. So 2/3 required. All in favor? Opposed? That passes then. So who's our first delegate, Mr. Clerk?
Mr. Chair, our first delegate tonight is Evan Wiseman from the Atmospheric Fund.
Sounds good. Mr. Wiseman, whenever you have a chance.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to Council as well for allowing me to speak to you tonight on the Town of Ajax's green development and environmental design guidelines. My name is Evan Wiseman, and I am the Senior Climate Policy Manager at the Atmospheric Fund, or TAF for short. We are a regional environmental agency for the Greater Toronto Hamilton area. So a quick little bit about us. TAF works by investing in low carbon solutions and helping to scale those solutions for broad implementation. We advance the most promising concepts by investing, providing grants, advocating, and implementing programs. And we focus on ideas that offer benefits beyond just carbon reductions and place an emphasis on improving people's health, creating new jobs, boosting efficiency, and contributing to a more fair society. So we are incredibly happy to see this update come before council. The work done by the Town of Ajax staff and partners should be commended, as developing these standards is not easy, but they are vital for building the better communities of tomorrow. TAF has been working with municipalities across the GTHA on green development guidelines and standards, and we support them for three primary reasons. The first reason is they're good for development. Green development guidelines and standards can positively impact the development industry. In Toronto, for instance, a significant portion of projects voluntarily target Tier 2 in the green standard and above. The added effect of this is that it has influenced developers to change how they operate elsewhere. One example is the company Concert Properties, which has committed to meeting the Toronto Green Standard requirements in all their builds across Southern Ontario, not just Toronto. So a lot of the developers that will be working in Ajax have already experienced the higher green standards, and they're already familiar with these practices. Improving building guidelines is exceptionally important in regions like Durham, where fully 1/3 of carbon emissions come from buildings. Ajax Council rightly identified addressing these issues in the Ajax Climate Risk and Resiliency Plan and the 2018 to 2022 Strategic Plan, Stronger Together. Additionally, consumer groups also support green standards, as efficiency standards lower monthly bills for owners and increase property values when it comes time to sell. In short, it makes a better product. The second reason we recommend green development standards is that they're good for growth. The population of Ajax is going to increase substantially in the coming years. Without green development standards, this growth will put increasing pressures on infrastructure, strain existing municipal resources, and undermine the quality of life for residents. Higher building standards will keep Ajax aligned with nearby jurisdictions such as Whitby, Toronto, as well as jurisdictions like the City of Pickering, the municipalities in Halton, Peel, and York regions that are all also looking at implementing green development standards. And the third reason we support them is that they're good for the environment. And I'll be direct about this. Without this and future updates, Ajax will not reach its climate targets as set out in this climate emergency declaration. Buildings are the second largest and growing source of emissions in Ajax and Durham. And we are happy to see the commitments in the proposed guidelines that will help curb future emissions. This update will have an important local impact by helping to address climate change, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and importantly, improving indoor health. And so this brings me to our recommendations. First of all, TAF recommends adopting the green development and environmental design guidelines as proposed by staff. And our second recommendation for council to consider is to move quickly to initiate the development of the next step of the guidelines, with structured updates every 4 years, with the next update being in 2026, 2030, and so on. This will help put Ajax on track to ensure all new development is built to near zero emissions before 2040. Scheduled updates will also ensure a clear and transparent process with established timelines for everybody involved. TAF is more than willing to help roll up our sleeves and assist Ajax in whatever capacity we can to help make your ambitious plans a reality. And again, I want to thank council again for your time and for Ajax for their leadership on the green design standards, as well as all the hard work being done to protect the environment now and in the future. And as a former resident, I'm really happy to see it as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Weissman. Any questions for the delegate? I have not a question, but I just have a very quick comment then. When we declared the climate emergency, one of the biggest points I made was, the town of Ajax was celebrating that we had hit our targets back in 2016. And, that's all I kept hearing over and over. And I kept asking staff at the time, because we had lost our environmental manager, so to speak, where are we now? Where do we sit? So Mr. Weissman actually connected with me last year, and painted a pretty bleak picture in that we actually got worse. Our emissions had gone up, if I'm not mistaken. Especially post-COVID, they had actually jumped up significantly. So he actually, pointed me at least towards the importance of the building guidelines, and that's where we are today. So just want to thank Mr. Wiseman for, getting us on track, so to speak. And like you said, it's the second largest. I'm assuming then automobiles are the first largest in terms of emissions.
Yeah, the transport emissions it's a pretty common thing, is that they're the biggest source of emissions across the GTHA.
Well, there's not much we can do municipally on that except to encourage electrical vehicles, but this we do have in our control. So just thank you for putting us on that. Regional Councillor Crawford, question, comment?
Yes, through you, actually, I think to you. What would we do with the recommendations that Mr. Wiseman had offered?
So I think if I'm not mistaken, they were built into this plan that you see today. Cameron was actually already on top of a lot of it. So the most recent email Evan had sent was forwarded to Mr. Richardson, incorporated this plan. And as far as the atmospherics fund is concerned, we're actually where we need to be as far as these building guidelines. Is that fair to say, Mr. Wiseman?
Yeah, absolutely. And just quickly on my second recommendation on that, it's more just for the purposes. I mean, Cameron did a great presentation, so he pretty much nailed it in that as well. And it's to the point on the scheduled update, just because another councillor asked about it as well. It's Toronto does the scheduled updates as well, and it's for the development industry. So they actually get like 4 to 8 years in advance heads up, usually in terms of like what the meat and potatoes are of the actual recommendations around updates. I work a lot with a lot of other regulations, and they get far less lead time from, say, the province or the federal government. So those types of updates is like they're fantastic.
Okay, great, thank you.
With no further questions, Mr. Wiseman, thank you very much for joining us, and again, thank you to the Atmospheric Fund for just your information on our carbon output.
Thank you.
Mr. Clerk, we have a second delegate, I believe.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chair. Our next delegate is Max and Dennis Tarski.
So Max and Dennis Tarski, after you.
Good evening, members of council. You
Good
got
evening.
2 in 1.
Yes.
We called 1 delegate, but we're actually 2.
Very efficient, very efficient. I appreciate it.
Yes. We'll try to keep it short. Thank you for giving us an opportunity to make the delegation. We have submitted a short written email this morning through the clerk. We would like to commend the town of Ajax, both the council and the staff, for this wonderful initiative. This is definitely needed as soon as possible, because those guidelines will form new buildings being built and will effectively form where the town next generations will be in terms of environment, energy consumption, etc. We agree with everything proposed. The reason for us to ask for the delegation is we would like to suggest 3 items that could perhaps make these guidelines much more efficient. As it's proposed right now, there are existing official plan policies, zoning policies, which are rigid, with some of them being somewhat arbitrary. And the proposed green guidelines will be built upon them. However, if the official plan policies or zoning bylaws would be less rigid, that would make the proposed green initiatives much more effective. What we are alluding to is, as an example, the existing limitation of a floor plate size in high-rise buildings are limited to 800 square meters for the tower portion of the building. Initially, that's done for reduced shadow impacts on surrounding residential neighborhoods. But however, it does have an unintended consequences, because the smaller the footprint of the floor plate of the building, the more consumption, the more energy consumption has to cool and heat the building throughout the life cycle of the building. So in one of our projects that we are proposing for Ajax on Kingston Road, our engineer went through exercise of comparing the proposed limit of 800 square meters and double the size of 1600 square meters for the floor plate. And the differences in energy consumptions are astronomical. It's actually 50%, 50% less for the double the size of a floor plate. Now, if it would be located next to low density residential neighborhoods, that creates a concern because you do have an increased shadow impacts, which are eroding, but nevertheless, it's an increased shadow impact. However, if you're surrounded by other high-rise buildings or in a commercial and adjacent industrial areas, then the shadow impact is not as prominent. However, the energy savings are very significant. And when we're talking about those differences, this is assuming the same type of materials, same types of finishes. It's just a simple mathematics. You have a less of an external side of the building, so less cooling, heating required.
There is also another metrics to it. When somebody is proposing to create buildings with even slightly larger footprint, it's sorry, it translates into a savings for everybody who is living in a building and for the savings for anybody who is buying units in this building, because you're building the same size of corridors, same staircase, same elevator shaft. But for example, instead of putting 12 apartments per floor, you're putting 14 apartments or 16 apartments. So now what's happening is you're taking all of these common area elements, which is cost to build, and you're dividing this between more of a units. So obviously each unit become cheaper because now less of a common area element falls on each particular unit. Now we understand that there has to be some kind of limit to the floor plate size. But just to give you an idea, the way it is right now, 800 square meters would represent building of a square of 28 meters per each side. You will increase it to 31 meter, which is different, it's totally negligible, and you already can fit 2 more apartments, because now you made your building, instead of 800 square meters, you made it 950 square meters. So from point of view of shadow, nobody ever gonna see any difference, but you just create a building which is about what 15-20% more efficient, just with 3 meters to the side. So we're not gonna tell you what the number is supposed to be to put in official plan. It's just we believe that 800 meters, it's very arbitrary number, and we don't think it's appropriate number because it's greatly limiting the efficiency of the building and the affordability of the building. Now, there is 2 more points.
Same applies to the height restrictions. Most of the official plan areas designated by official plans are limited to 25 stories, which makes sense once again next to a residential neighborhood. But for example, in Ajax GO station, which is meant to be a higher density redevelopment, this number is purely arbitrary because you don't have any residential in sight. So going higher there is not infringing on anybody's privacy. However, that gives an opportunity to create a much more energy efficient building and much more cost efficient development and more efficient land use. And lastly, the parking requirements. We completely agree with the proposal of making EV compliant parking. Pretty much you can bump it up to 100% because 10 years from now, there will be a ban on manufacturing internal combustion engines throughout the world and in Canada as well. So probably 10 years from now, with the rate of people changing their cars, majority of cars will be EVs. So getting to the 100% EV compliant or compatible parking spots makes sense. However, to further reduce gas emissions from cars and to reduce car dependency, we believe that minimum requirements for parking should be eliminated altogether, similar to what Toronto just recently did in their bylaws. Because market actually dictates it's way better than the policy. By the time the policy passes through the official plan amendments, etc., it's a bit outdated with the rate everything is changes nowadays. You have more and more people realizing that between the cost of their parking, buying it up front, let's say it costs $50,000 or $70,000 to buy a parking spot in a new development nowadays, because this is how much it costs to build it. If you amortize your mortgage for this extra $50,000 or $70,000 that somebody have to spend, so that's like $300 a month extra paying just to have a place where you can keep your car. Then there is a monthly maintenance from a condominium, which is $50. And this is, by the way, recent numbers from new development in Oshawa. $50 a month to maintain the spot. Then you have your car cost, insurance cost, and gas. So if you put it all together for a simple household with 2 people, you better off using public transit, active transit, or whenever you do need a car, maybe rent one out or hire an Uber. Yeah. So you don't take up a space on the road most of the time. You do depend on public transit more, increasing the ridership, and that would be less cars on the street. The only way you can, per se, gently force people that way is to provide more with housing without the parking spot, which is more affordable because of that people can afford these houses, more attainable, but they will make this mental switch of maybe I don't need the car if I want a better quality of life. I will be riding the transit, especially if it's around the GO station or along the Kingston corridor or wherever the public transit is readily available. We understand that green guidelines don't talk about those things in particular. The essence of the green and energy efficient design guidelines is to address all those matters. And without some kind of a connect and a feedback between the existing official plan policies and zoning provisions, it wouldn't be as effective as it potentially could. So we would propose to look into some kind of, perhaps the design guidelines should supersede existing official plan policies. They come into effect starting from May 1st. So perhaps a new application that's coming in, if it complies with the design guidelines, or maybe it switches to the tier 2 instead of going with the mandatory tier 1, it should get some kind of a leeway from matching existing official plan policies on those arbitrary numbers.
Because official plan only going to be changed a year and a half from now. I believe it's supposed to be, the new division is supposed to be finalized by end of 2023. So it's almost.
Max and Dennis, sorry to interrupt. We do have 5-minute limit on delegates. No, okay, thank you so much. If you don't mind, I'm actually going to pass this over to Mr. Moranis. Mr. I'm going to ask your Ms. Andes to just kind of respond, because I think what you're describing falls more under the OPA as opposed to the green building standards. Steph, could you comment on that?
Yes, thank you. Through the chair to Max and Dennis Tarski. It's legislatively, we can't have guidelines supersede official plan policies or zoning. So your comments can be addressed through the official plan review, which, as you noted, we hope to start in 2023. So the comments with regard to maximum building height and floor plate, maximum floor plate for a tower would have to be addressed in the official plan policies first, and then that would find its way into the zoning bylaw through a subsequent comprehensive review of the zoning bylaw. However, the parking rate, minimum parking rate comments you have now can actually be addressed through the current comprehensive zoning bylaw review, which has been suspended for a little while, but staff will be looking to continue working on it a little later this year and have technical reports and a draft amendment come out in 2023. So I know you have been involved in the comprehensive zoning bylaw review process, and when the opportunity comes around again with the technical reports and the draft amendment, we will consult with you again and ensure to get your comments and look at how they can be addressed in those provisions.
Great. Mr. Romaneski, do you want to add anything to that?
Nothing to add. Steph covered it all off. Thank you.
Perfect. Do any members of council have any questions to the Tarskis? Well, then in that case, we thank you for your delegation and we appreciate your comments.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So back to the agenda, we'll actually call up then. Sorry, I'm on 5.1 PDS 2022-11 Green Development Environmental Design Guidelines Project Update. I need a mover and a seconder that 1, council adopt Green Development Environmental Design Guidelines found in attachment 3, and 2, the council authorize staff to proceed with implementation of the Green Development and Environmental Design Guidelines. I see Regional Councillor Dyes and Local Councillor Bauer as the mover and seconder. Any questions or comments on the report? None by council. I'll just add, Mr. Richardson, thank you so much. You have, between your work with Wilfrid Laurier University and other endeavors with our conservation authorities, you've now become the environmental hero that Ajax needs. So you couldn't have come at a better time. Thank you so much for all your work on this. And of course, staff, we will call to vote then. And I actually think it's appropriate for a recorded vote, Mr. Clerk.
Okay, thank you. On the motion,
Madam Clerk,
in favor, no problem. In favor, opposed, Councillor Tyler Moore.
In favor.
Councillor Bauer.
In favor?
Councillor Crawford.
In favor.
Pardon me, I meant Regional Councillor Crawford. Regional Councillor Dice.
In favor.
Councillor
In
Khan.
favor.
And Deputy Mayor Lee.
In favor.
Thank you.
Thank you, and that passes. Thank you all. Moving on to the agenda now, we have item 5.2. This is Envision Durham Municipal Comprehensive Review, Growth Management Study, Alternative Land Need Scenarios, the Town of Ajax comments. I believe Mr. McCullough will be leading us through a presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just give me a moment while I bring up my presentation. All right. Good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Sean McCullough. I'm the Supervisor of Planning, Policy, and Research here at the Town of Ajax. And tonight I'll be providing an overview of the alternative land need scenario results produced by the region as part of the Envision Durham process. So as part of the Envision Durham, the region has been preparing the growth management study to determine how and eventually where to grow in accordance with the Growth Plan 2020. Between July and April of 2021, the region released the growth management study in 4 chapters. And these were the region-wide growth analysis, the housing intensification study technical report, the employment strategy technical report, urban land needs analysis. Following the release of these reports, the region's Planning and Economic Development Committee directed staff to review additional growth scenarios, examining various housing and employment options. In December 2021, Regional Council endorsed a series of employment area conversion requests, which also needed to be factored into the analysis. So before we jump into the results, I just want to remind Council the 2 areas that are being considered. So first, we have community areas, and these are where the majority of residential growth will occur, as well as most office and as well as population-related employment. It was formerly referred generally as the living area, but it also includes built-up areas, designated greenfields, as well as strategic growth areas. The other area is employment areas, and this is separate, but they are where the majority of employment-related employment or industrial growth is to occur. And I know in the past we've referred to as the blue areas in the official plan. The region released the Alternative Land Need Scenario Assessment Summary Report on March 11th of this year for consultation. And the report provides an overview of the 5 scenarios considered using various variations in housing unit mix, intensification rates, and designated greenfield area density targets. The results of the mathematical equation using these various inputs and comparing against the existing land available identify the amount of community area needed to be added to the settlement area boundary, which are identified in the report. The reports also include a summary of 2 employment scenarios that were considered. The scenarios factor the employment area conversion request that Regional Council endorsed, and therefore the results are slightly differ from what was shown in the October 2021 report. So first up, looking at the community areas. So as I mentioned, the region considered 5 scenarios. So scenario 1 is really an emphasis on low density residential development. And you'll also hear this referred to as the Hempson scenario, as it was based on a number of inputs that went into the Growth Plan 2020 report prepared by Hempson Consulting. Scenario 2 is also predominantly low density. It just shifts that housing unit mix slightly with a little bit less low density, but it's still predominantly low density housing. Scenario 3 is what I would refer to as a minimum intensification scenario, but the region is also referring to it as shifting the unit mix. Then we get into scenario 4, which is an updated original growth management scenario, the one that was presented back last fall. And this one they're referring to as balancing the unit mix. And then finally, we've got scenario 5, which is increased intensification scenario, also referred to as an emphasis on high densities. Generally, I won't go through all of the housing mix. You can see them here in the table. But generally, scenario 1 has that highest percentage of low density housing. And then as you progress upwards through the scenarios, that unit mix starts to shift and slowly become more and more high density. And you can see in a moment, I'll give you the results. But first, I just go over, the region has also identified 5 principles that they're using to evaluate these scenarios. So the first is, does it achieve the growth plan targets? The next portion is, does it provide a fulsome range of housing choice and respond to demand? Number 3 is, does it support strategic growth areas in achieving their planned function as compact, transit-oriented communities? Number 4 is, does the scenario negatively impact agricultural land? Does it provide sustainable development patterns? And does it respond to the region's climate emergency declaration? And then finally, we've got number 5, which, does it capitalize on the region's employment strengths and position the region to remain economically attractive? And this one considers things such as, are there housing types that accommodate families being provided, those types of things. Now, staff have noted in our comments that the principles could be improved to recognize the financial impact that low density development also has on municipalities, and that can be considered into the analysis as the region moves forward. So here we have the results as presented in the report. So the first, I will mention that scenarios 1 and 2, they do not comply with the Growth Plan 2020 density and intensification targets. They also result in the largest amount of community area land need being required. And you can see here that it's generally 5,400 hectares or 2,600 hectares of land needing to be added to the region's urban area. Scenario 3 complies with the growth plan, but it does little to promote growth in strategic growth areas. And it does not position the region to respond to the climate emergency, still requiring almost 1,500 hectares of agriculture or of land to be added to the urban area. Scenario 4 also achieves the growth plan targets, but it still requires 950 hectares of community area land to be added. And there's also less emphasis on medium and high density development compared to scenario 5. Now, staff are supporting scenario 5 as it complies with the growth plan minimum targets, and it's the only option that proposes to increase the intensification target. I note that it proposes an intensification target of 55%, and this is still lower than the 2017 growth plan, which was proposing to go to 60% between 2031 and 2041. While the report notes that this option would result in supply of high density housing that may not be absorbed by the market and limit new families, staff believe that this option best results in the greatest balance of housing options across the region, which are currently lacking. By 2051, this option would result in 46% of all housing in the region being low density, 23% being medium density, and 31% being high density, also working towards optimizing those strategic growth areas needing to be added to the settlement area boundary, protecting agricultural land, and choosing to focus on intensification. It also helps the region economically by reducing traffic, promoting transit, which would result in that reduced traffic and allowing the movement of trucks and employees, and that helps from an employment standpoint as well. So next, I'm going to shift to employment areas. So as I mentioned, the consultant did update the scenarios to include the employment area conversions supported by council. And the region's added a new scenario that increases the amount of jobs that are being accommodated through employment intensification in this case. So scenario 1 assumes that 15% of job growth would occur through intensification, whereas scenario 2 increases that to 20%. So you can see here that the scenarios result in either a need of 1,351 hectares, or in scenario 2, 1,171 hectares of new employment area to be added. For comparison purposes, the October report identified a need for 1,164 hectares before considering that employment area conversions. Staff feel that scenario 2 is achievable, as 20% of all gross floor area added has been through additions and expansions in our existing employment areas across the region. And this does not consider additional new gross floor area that could be added through land division applications where you've got that excess land or surplus land that could be used to benefit the larger employment area. It's also important to note that vacant land is needed to attract new employment area jobs to the region as the region moves forward. And as such, staff support employment area scenario 2. Now, when we start bringing these numbers together, just for comparison purposes, when you add together that community area land need as well as the employment area land need, it really does range from a high of 6,750 hectares when you consider scenario 1 in both the community area and the employment area, to a low of 1,171 hectares when you only add the land needed for the employment area in that scenario 2 situation. So staff are recommending the council support community area scenario 5, which is the higher intensification, as well as employment area scenario 2, resulting in a need for 1,171 hectares of new land to be added to the region's boundary to support job growth only. All other growth would be directed to existing community areas. Now, in terms of next steps, the region has released a public survey on the Envision Durham website that will be available until April 14th. And I recommend that anyone watching this presentation this evening, any members of the public and even members of council, to visit that public survey and complete it. Regional staff have also identified that the preferred scenarios will be presented to the May 3rd Regional Planning and Economic Development Committee, barring any setbacks. Following that, regional staff and their consultant would move forward with the phase 2 of the growth management study to identify options for and locations for those boundary expansions. And much more consultation is expected on that phase 2. And then eventually we still are working towards it. I'm sure you'll see me a couple more times, but we are moving towards that regional official plan amendment, which will be released for draft. And we expect that sometime in early 2023. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. McCullough. Any questions from council? I see Councillor Tyler Moore.
Thank you so much, Chair. And thank you very much for this, in what is, in my opinion, an extremely important topic about housing and employment and the land we have and how difficult it's been for young people, seniors trying to downsize. Just wanted to draw reference when you said, sir, so thank you for the report, is what I was getting to. I wanted to draw reference through the chair to you, Mr. McCullough, the adding land to the region boundaries. So that's just as it says, it doesn't mean for Ajax, but that's just a general direction that staff is asking for to give to the region, to the powers that be, correct?
Through the chair to Councillor Tyler Moore, that's correct. So right now we're in that first phase of this program, and really it's determining how regional council and members of elected officials feel that this region should move forward in growing. So right now what we're just doing is we're establishing what that number is and how much land would need to be added. And then phase 2 will then go into that phase of, okay, now that we know how much, and you are correct that Ajax doesn't have any where to grow. We have a fixed urban boundary and we're surrounded by the green belt. But there would be the next task would then look at the white belt areas that are available in the region and look at where that land may be added.
Right. Okay. I just wanted to get that clear, even though it says that to the region boundary. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Tyler. Any other questions on the?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. McCullough. It's always interesting listening to you. So I don't know if this is a simple question, but as far as the 5 scenarios go, what is the purpose of including a scenario 1 and 2?
Through the chair to Councillor Bauer, that's a good question. So scenario 1 and 2 were really considered because they were really pushed forward by the building industry. So the Hempson report, that was what was originally developed when they were looking at the growth plan 2020 and there were amendments to that. So that was added for a baseline and to show just really how it does, how it would be implemented if they were to move forward with that case. And I think when the region got into that, they didn't quite expect it to be the intensification target being so low and those designated greenfield target densities being so low. So certainly they were put in there at the request of the building industry. And now we're seeing that those results, they just don't comply to the growth plan.
Right. So it's almost just proving that low density is not the option.
That's
not the way to go. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for answering my question.
Thank you, Councillor
That's
Bauer.
it, Chair.
Regional Councillor Dies. You're good? Okay, Ms. McCullough, I think that is good for on the presentation then. I think we will go ahead and move to the report. So we have 5.2 PDS 2022-12 Envision Durham, MCR Growth Management Study, alternative land need scenarios, the Town of Ajax comments. Moved by, we need a mover or seconder, moved by Councillor Bauer, seconded by Regional Councillor Crawford. That council received the report entitled Envision Durham Municipal Comprehensive Review, Growth Management Study, Alternative Land Need Scenarios, Town of Ajax comments for information. Number 2, council endorsed the Land Needs Assessment Scenario 5, emphasis on higher densities residential, and urged the region to take a progressive approach that eliminates the need for an expanded community area, responds best to the climate emergency declaration, protects agricultural land, and results in the greatest balance of housing units throughout the region by 2051. 3, that council endorse employment scenario 2, higher employment intensification, maximizing existing serviced employment lands throughout the region by promoting employment intensification while reducing the amount of new employment area needed to accommodate job growth. And 4, that a copy of this report be forwarded to the region of Durham and all Durham area municipalities. Any questions or comments on the report? Then I'll call to vote then, and I think this would also be a good time for a recorded vote, Madam Chair.
On the motion, in favor or opposed, Councillor Tyler Moran,
In favor.
Councillor Bauer,
In favor.
Regional Councillor Crawford,
In favor.
Regional Councillor Dies,
In favor?
Councillor Khan,
In favor?
and Deputy Mayor Lee.
In favor. Fantastic. Thank you to all. Next on the agenda is item number 6, adjournment. Moved by Councillor Khan, seconded by Councillor Bauer, that the April 4th, 2022 meeting of the Community Affairs and Planning Committee be adjourned. All in favor? Opposed? Thank you very much.